Okay, so I've been seeing a lot of people trending hashtag support Andrew all over Instagram and Twitter and even YouTube. And here's the thing. I love Andrew as Spider-Man a lot. But it's obvious he's not coming back as Spider-Man because if you haven't heard, Marvel and Sony finally came to a negotiation like this weekend, and they said that, I think it was like around this weekend, and it's apparently they're very much considering, they're almost positively gonna do a another reboot of the Spider-Man franchise, and a lot of people want Andrew Garfield to stay. But as much as I like him, he's not coming back. I mean, I would like to see him team up with, Tony Stark, and I don't get me wrong, it would be incredible to see Andrew Garfield team up with Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth and Mark Ruffalo and everybody else on screen. But it's not going to happen for a couple reasons. First off, if Marvel was willing to take an already existing superhero franchise and say, oh yeah, this entire time it was in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then they would have done that with Hulk, and they would have done that with Daredevil. And I know some of you may argue that the 2003 Hulk and the 2003 Daredevil was even worse received than The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was, but as much as I like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and even though it wasn't as hated as those movies were, it still got a lot of hate, and it was still got some mixed reviews. And in fact, Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, has said that basically he said everything that people complained about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and he said he hated The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And considering he makes all the decisions, that pretty much explains it right there. So Spider-Man is getting a reboot. Now, as sad as this is, I don't think the franchise would have known what to do with itself after The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So, I think that might be a good option. And also, I think it's time to move on. But without further ado, since I haven't done a video in a while, I thought I would talk about my thoughts on what the Spider-Man reboot should be, the next Spider-Man reboot. So, let's begin. Okay, so before I get to my casting ideas, I'm going to talk about what they should do for the reboot, and I think what characters should be there. First off, I think that, well, there have been sources that have said that the villains, Marvel wants their villains to be Kingpin, who will be the same Kingpin that appears in the Daredevil series, Shocker, and or Mysterio. Now, I say and or because they're not sure if they're just going to pick one of these villains to put in there, one or two, or all of them. But I think they should put all of them. And I know Kevin Feige complained about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and one of the things he said was, 3 villains, give me a break. But I think that this is a scenario where 3 villains really could work, because I think that the villains, here's how I think it could go, though. I think Mysterio is the central villain. Spider-Man, he gets the most screen time, and he fights Spider-Man the most. The Kingpin is kind of pulling the strings. He could be like that behind-the-scenes villain, who's basically all the crime is organized by him, and we kind of see him. He doesn't really fight Spider-Man that much in the movie, but we see him basically scheming in his lair. That's kind of what they used to do in the 90s Spider-Man series with Kingpin. And I think that would work with Kingpin here. And I think that the Shocker could be, the Shocker is more of a B-list villain. So I think the Shocker could be, kind of like, he's a thug. Like, if you've played the Ultimate Spider-Man video game, the Shocker is in it, but he's not really the biggest villain. He's like this thug who will show up from time to time, and Spider-Man will have to defeat him. He's not that big a threat. And that's how I always viewed Shocker. Shocker was never really the biggest menace for me. I mean, there are much more threatening menaces like Doc Ock and Venom and Carnage and Green Goblin. But like there are more people that are just more of a menace than the Shocker is, and I think that would work. As to whether, also I think that they should do his ultimate costume, because I think his original costume, like with Electro's costume, is too silly to put on screen. But yeah, I believe that Shocker, that's how all the villains should be. Now, first and foremost, what the movie should be, first and foremost, no origin story. We've heard the origin story a billion frickin' times. I mean, The Amazing Spider-Man got away with it because they changed it a little bit, and they've done that a little bit sometimes. But I mean, it's just gotten to a point where it's a fatigue. I mean, it's just turning into a huge fatigue. Like, all the time we hear, oh, Uncle Ben, I'm so sad Uncle Ben died. And it's a great origin. It's a great origin, don't get me wrong. But, I mean, we all get it. Even if you know nothing about Spider-Man, you know the origin of Spider-Man. I mean, you can try not to know the origin of Spider-Man, but you'll still know the origin of Spider-Man. I mean, you could have been living under a rock for the last decade, and you'd still know Spider-Man's origin. I mean, so yeah, so no origin. Maybe, I mean, if you want to mention Uncle Ben a couple times or have like some flashbacks, that's fine. But again, they shouldn't really do that. Now here's the thing. They've also said that Spider-Man, they're gonna focus less on the love interest, which, as much as I love like the love story in the Amazing Spider-Man films between Peter and Gwen, I still think this is a bold move and a very smart move, because nobody really wants to see Mary Jane back. Even Mary Jane fans really don't want to see Mary Jane back in the franchise after what Kirsten Dunst did with it. God. Yeah, I mean, they could do Gwen, because Gwen, in my opinion, is the best love interest. She was Peter's first love. But here's the thing, nothing can really top Emma Stone's portrayal of the character. So I would just go with no love interest. But what I think they should do is, I think they should go with what Stan Lee did in the classic comics, where Peter is kind of that outsider. Nobody really likes him that much, and he's kind of trying to get a girlfriend, but he never really can because he's kind of a nerd. And, I mean, maybe you can throw Betty Brant and Liz Allen into the mix, but, yeah, no, like, legitimate love interest, I think, because that's basically turning into a fatigue, unless you put Black Cat later in the franchise. That might work, but not for the first movie. But for the first movie, Mysterio is the main villain. Mysterio may be my favorite Spider-Man villain of all time, because, and, also Mysterio, I really do hope he comes into this movie, not only because he may be my favorite Spider-Man villain of all time, but also because he could translate perfectly onto the big screen. I mean, it could be like, he could make Spider-Man into, like, an Inception-styled Spider-Man movie, if Mysterio did that, because he's the master of illusions. So that really would, I've always thought that Mysterio could really translate well onto the big screen. And so, I think Mysterio should be the central villain. He fights Spider-Man, most of the time, as I said. Shocker could show up, like once or twice. But I always pictured, I kind of pictured the beginning of the movie being, like, Spider-Man, basically, as usual, giving some monologue, oh, I'm Peter Parker, my life is a little bit, messed up, or something like that, and then, of course, maybe show him being late to class, maybe show a few of the disadvantages to being Spider-Man, which they usually do show in the comics, that kind of thing. basically make us feel bad for Spider-Man. That's how I imagine this reboot opening. Um, so yeah, they should do that, and then eventually, I think that even in the opening, they could have like Shocker, and he could be like defeating Shocker. But what I think that they should really do for casting wise, as far as cast goes, we're finally getting into the cast. They've already cast somebody for Kingpin who's going to be in the Daredevil Netflix series. So if they use Kingpin, it'll have to be that Kingpin. Mysterio, I've said this a lot, should be played by Zachary Quinto. Now, Shocker, I was just about to say Spider-Man, but I'll get to him right after I say Shocker. I'm really not sure who to do for Shocker, because I don't want it to be too over the top, like with the Rhino in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I think that the Shocker should be played by more of a comedic villain, a comedic guy, because I always thought the Shocker was more so, he's kind of become, especially with the Ultimate Comics, he's kind of been more so for laughs. So I think that they should just get like a comedic guy. They shouldn't get like some really, really big actor. They should get a famous actor who's talented, but they shouldn't, and not somebody that's too over the top like Adam Sandler, but they should get somebody that's kind of a comedic actor. They shouldn't get a very, very big actor who's really serious, because I think not only because Shocker, I think, was made for laughs, but also because it would be a waste of talent to get just a really big, serious actor like Christian Bale or Chris Pine or something like that. But now for Spider-Man, I think that, well, first off, I think my choice for Spider-Man would be Arthur Darvill. That's kind of a new one. I know not many people have been really mentioning Arthur Darvill. Actually, nobody has, not even in fan cast, but I'd like to see Arthur Darvill as Spider-Man. For those of you who don't know, he played Rory Williams on Doctor Who, and he did a pretty good job. So I think that he'd be a good Spider-Man. The reason why I think he'd be a good Spider-Man is because there are still some people that haven't gotten over the loss of Tobey Maguire, and it's gonna take quite a while for people to move past Andrew Garfield. So I think, because whenever they cast a Spider-Man, it seems for some reason they just can't make every fan happy. I think Arthur Darvill could make every fan happy because he's kind of got that Tobey Maguire-ish vibe to him, but at the same time he also has that Andrew Garfield-ish vibe to him as well. So I really think that would be a plus. Also, Rory is a very likable character on Doctor Who, and a lot of people complained, I don't complain about this, but a lot of people complained that Andrew Garfield was too unlikable as Spider-Man, and if they made him like Rory, then, he could be likable. Now, the two other people that I think are probably the most likely, at least at this moment, are Drake Bell, because Drake Bell currently voices Spider-Man on Ultimate Spider-Man, and Logan Lerman, who played Percy Jackson in the two crappy Percy Jackson movies, even though he did a good job. Drake Bell, I'm a big fan of Drake Bell, but he can't play Spider-Man. I think he'd be a little bit too unlikable, and I'm not a big fan of his voice acting for Spider-Man on the Ultimate Spider-Man show, so I wouldn't go with him. Logan Lerman, on the other hand, while he's not my first choice, I still think he'd do a very good job, because as horrible as the Percy Jackson movies were, he did a great job. And also, if you're going for a teenage Spider-Man, which is what Marvel wants, then he's really perfect for that. So I would still be a happy person, even if they cast Logan Lerman instead of Arthur Darvill. But you can tell me what you guys think in the comments section below.